After her husband of 30 years divorced her at 58 and took everything, she was left with only one thing he couldn't touch: the deed to her father's forgotten drive-in theater. What she found there wasn't just a second chance. It was the truth that would finally set her free. If you've ever felt like your story was over, stick around, because this is about how to find the first page of the next chapter. Hit that subscribe button if you believe in new beginnings. The air in Ms. Davies' office was the color of weak tea, filtered through blinds that sliced the afternoon sun into pale, dusty stripes across her mahogany desk. It was the kind of expensive, soulless quiet that costs $400 an hour. The quiet of endings. I sat in a leather chair that was too deep, feeling like a child who had been called to the principal's office. A 58-year-old child. The final papers were signed. A thick stack of them sat between us, a tombstone for a 30-year marriage. Richard's signature was a confident, arrogant slash of black ink. Mine was a faint, trembling blue line, the last tremor of a life that had just flatlined. Ms. Davies, a woman half my age with eyes that were kind but ruthlessly efficient, pushed a single, folded document across the desk. It was old, the paper yellowed and soft at the creases. "This is yours, Eleanor." It was never marital property. It was willed to you by your father, held in a trust that dissolved on your 18th birthday. Richard's lawyers tried to argue it had become a shared asset through neglect, but the title is ironclad. It's yours and yours alone. I picked it up. The paper felt warm, alive. I didn't need to open it to know what it was. The deed to the Starlight Drive-In, a place I hadn't seen in 40 years, a place I had been taught to forget. Richard had called it that worthless patch of dirt, a relic, a failure, just like, I suppose, he had eventually come see me. "He gets the house," I said, my voice a dry rustle. "The accounts, the investments, the art." He assumed the corresponding debts, Ms. Davies clarified gently. It was meant to be a comfort, but it wasn't. The debts were a strategic part of his business. The assets were his life. Our life. And I looked at the folded paper in my hand. "You get the $2,000 from the joint checking account, your personal belongings, your vehicle," and that she nodded at the deed. "I am sorry, Eleanor. We fought for more. But he had everything tied up in corporate structures you weren't a party to. It was a very well-planned separation on his part. A well-planned execution. For 2 years, he had been moving money, restructuring assets, preparing. For 2 years, I had been arranging flowers, planning dinner parties, and wondering why he seemed so distant. The naivete of it felt like a hot stone in my stomach. He hadn't just left me. He had hollowed me out, ensuring I couldn't even afford to be a ghost in his new life. What am I supposed to do with a dead drive-in? I whispered, more to myself than to her. Ms. Davies leaned forward, her professional mask slipping for just a second. "I don't know, but it's a place to start. It's land, Eleanor. It's the only thing he couldn't take." I left her office and walked into the blinding, indifferent city sunlight. The honk of a taxi made me jump. For 30 years, a driver had picked me up. For 30 years, my biggest decision on a Tuesday was whether to serve salmon or sea bass. Now, the sheer, screaming reality of my situation was a physical force pressing in on me. I was 58 years old. I had no career, no savings, and a 2012 sedan that was paid for. My entire net worth was $2,000 and a worthless patch of dirt. I got into my car, the familiar smell of worn leather a small, sad comfort. I didn't go back to the hotel where I was staying, a place with beige walls and complimentary toiletries that smelled of nothing. Instead, I drove. I drove out of the city, away from the sleek glass towers that housed Richard's lawyers, his accountants, his new life. The GPS was off. I was driving on instinct, on a memory buried under decades of carefully curated forgetting. I was going north. I was going home. The drive took 4 hours. For hours of watching the landscape bleed from concrete and steel to manicured suburbs, then to sprawling farmland, and finally to the dense, untamed green of the Northwoods. The farther I drove, the more the tension in my shoulders began to ease. The air coming through the open window changed. It smelled of pine and damp earth, the scent of my childhood. Richard had hated it up here. He'd called it primitive. He said it smelled of decay. Maybe he was right. But to me, it smelled like the truth. I thought about my father. He was a silhouette in my memory, a man who smelled of motor oil, popcorn, and Old Spice. He died when I was 17, a sudden, shocking heart attack that had ripped the heart out of our little family. My mother, fragile and unequipped for the world, sold our house and moved us to the city within a year. She'd met Richard not long after. He was stable. He was ambitious. He was everything my father wasn't. He was safe. My mother, in her grief, had pushed me toward that safety, and I had walked right into the cage without a second thought. We never spoke of the drive-in. It was part of the past, and the past was a place of pain. To Richard, it was an embarrassment, a failed business left by a man who dreamed too much and planned too little. It was easier to let it go, to let the weeds grow, to let the story be rewritten. By the time I turned onto the old county highway, the sun was low in the sky, painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple and soft orange. I almost missed the turnoff. The old sign, a glorious neon starburst in my memory, was gone. In its place was a simple wooden post, nearly swallowed by overgrown sumac. The gravel road was more potholes than road, and my car bucked and groaned as I eased it down the path. And then I saw it. The great white screen stood like a monolith against the darkening sky. It was skeletal, panels missing like knocked-out teeth, stained with rust and mildew, but was still standing. The ticket booth was a collapsed heap of splintered wood. The tall, looping metal poles that once held speakers for each car stood in uneven rows, silent sentinels in a field of waist-high weeds. The concession stand, a long, low building of cinder block and peeling paint, was boarded up tight. It was a ruin, a monument to failure, just as Richard had always said. I pulled the car to a stop where the first row of cars would have been, cut the engine, and just sat there as the last of the light faded from the sky. The silence was absolute. No traffic, no sirens, no noise. Just the whisper of the wind through the tall grass and the distant call of a whipped poor will. A wave of despair, so profound it felt like drowning, washed over me. Miss Davies was wrong. This wasn't a place to start. This was a place to end. This was a graveyard, and I was its only ghost. I got out of the car, the tall, wet grass soaking the cuffs of my pants. I walked toward the concession stand, my hand tracing the rough, gritty texture of the cinder block wall. A heavy padlock, rusted nearly solid, held a thick chain across the front door. It was hopeless. Everything was sealed, forgotten, dead. I cried then. Not for the divorce, not for the money, not for Richard. I cried for the 17-year-old girl who lost her father and never got to say a proper goodbye. I cried for the man who had built this place with his own two hands, whose dreams were now rotting in a field. I cried because I was 58 years old, utterly alone, and standing in the wreckage of a life I didn't even recognize as my own. The tears were hot and useless. They changed nothing. When I was done, the sky was black, studded with a billion cold, distant stars. The starlight. My father had named it well. Shivering, I went back to the car to get my jacket. My hand brushed against the glove compartment. On a whim, I opened it. Inside, amongst old insurance cards and a dried-out pen, was a small, heavy ring of keys. They were from my mother's house, which had been sold a decade ago. But on the ring, separate from the others, was a single, strange-looking brass key. It was long and thin, with an ornate, circular head. I had no idea what it was for. I'd probably transferred it from car to car for 20 years without a thought. I took the key and a small flashlight from the emergency kit in the trunk and walked back to the concession stand. The front door was a lost cause, but around the back there was a smaller, metal door, probably for deliveries. It had a different lock, a smaller, inset one that looked as old as the building itself. It was a long shot, a stupid, desperate flicker of hope in the overwhelming dark. My hand was shaking as I pushed the key into the lock. It resisted, gritty with rust and time. I wiggled it gently, then with more force. For a moment, nothing happened. I was about to give up, to accept the finality of the decay, when I felt a faint, grinding click. The sound was deafening in the silence. I turned the key, and the lock tumbler turned with it. I pulled the handle, and the heavy door groaned open on protesting hinges, releasing a gust of stale, musty air. I stepped inside, sweeping the flashlight beam across the darkness. The air was thick with the smell of dust, damp, and something else, something faintly sweet like stale sugar and old paper. The main concession area was a disaster. The counter was covered in a thick layer of grime, and an ancient popcorn machine sat in the corner, its glass clouded and grim. But behind the counter, a door stood slightly ajar. It led to a small office. The office was a time capsule. A heavy wooden desk sat against one wall, a rotary phone on its corner. An old calendar was tacked to the wall, frozen on July 1983. And on the desk, right in the center, was a metal strongbox. It wasn't locked with a key, but with two heavy latches. My heart hammered in my chest. I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed newspaper clippings about movie openings, were three thick manila envelopes tied together with twine. My name was written on the top one in my father's familiar, blocky handwriting. Eleanor. And that's when my story really began. Not in a lawyer's office full of endings, but in a dusty, forgotten office full of secrets. What I was about to read would change everything I thought I knew about my father, about this place, and about the 30 years of my life I had just lost. It's amazing, isn't it, how a whole life can pivot on a single, rusty key. If you've ever had a moment like that, a discovery that changed your entire world, I want to hear about it in the comments. Your story matters, and this community we're building here is a place for those stories to be heard. I took the box back to the car, the weight of it a solid, grounding presence on the passenger seat beside me. I couldn't read the letters there, not in the dark, not in the belly of that sleeping giant. I drove to the nearest town, a sleepy little place called Pine Creek that hadn't seemed to change a bit in 40 years. I found a motel with a flickering neon sign that promised color TV and vacancy. The room was clean, anonymous, and perfect. I sat on the edge of the stiff, polyester bedspread and untied the twine. My hands trembled. This felt like a violation, like opening a tomb. The first envelope was labeled, "For my Ellie." When you're ready, I took a deep breath and pulled out a sheaf of papers, dozens of pages covered in my father's handwriting. The ink was faded to a soft blue-gray. The date at the top of the first page was August 10th, 1983, a month after he died. No, that wasn't right. I looked again. August 10th, 1982. He had written this almost a full year before his heart gave out. The letter began, "My dearest Ellie, if you are reading this, it means I'm gone. I hope you are not reading it for a very, very long time. I hope you're old and gray and surrounded by grandchildren who you bring to see the pictures here at the Starlight. But I'm a realist. My own father died young, and his father before him. The men in our family have bad tickers and worry too much. So I'm writing this now, just in case." I had to stop. My throat was thick, my eyes burning. To see his voice on the page, so clear, so present, was like a punch to the gut. I could hear him saying the words, the slight Midwestern drawl, the gentle cadence. I forced myself to continue reading. "There are things you need to know about this place, things your mother won't be able to tell you. She's a good woman, Ellie, but she sees the world in black and white, in profit and loss. I see it in light and shadow. This drive-in, it was never great business. I know people in town think I was a fool for pouring everything we had into it. Maybe they're right, but it was never about the money." He went on to describe his dream. He'd come back from the war with his head full of noise and darkness. He found peace in the movies, sitting in the dark with strangers, sharing a story. He wanted to build a place like that for other people, a place of magic under the stars. He bought the land cheap, a useless, marshy field nobody wanted, and spent 5 years clearing it himself, building the screen, wiring the poles, pouring the concrete for the concession stand. Every dollar we had went into this dirt, Ellie. Every ounce of sweat. Your mother wanted new curtains. I bought a new projector bulb. She wanted a new car. I bought 300 new speakers. It was a strain on us, I know that. But I believed in it. I believed that giving people a place to dream was a worthy thing to do. The letter took a turn. But dreams don't pay the bills. By 1980, things were bad. The multiplexes were killing us. The price of film prints was going through the roof. I took out a second mortgage, then a third. I borrowed from men I shouldn't have. Your mother never knew the extent of it. I shielded her from it. That was my mistake. I left her unprepared. A cold dread crept up my spine. This wasn't the simple story of a dreamer I remembered. This was a story of desperation. A man came to see me, a developer from a city. His name was Marcus Thorne. He wanted the land. He said this whole area was going to be prime real estate in 20 or 30 years, once the new highway expansion came through. He offered me a lot of money, enough to pay off all our debts, and then some. Enough to buy your mother those new curtains 100 times over. I said no. He couldn't understand it. He saw a failing business on a patch of swamp. He called me a sentimental fool. He came back a few more times, his offers getting bigger, his tone getting uglier. He said things like, a man has to protect his family's future, and accidents happen out here in the middle of nowhere. He wasn't just a businessman, Ellie. He was a predator. The last time he came, I told him to get off my property and never come back. He smiled. It was a terrible smile. He said, one way or another, Mr. Gable, I get what I want. This land will be mine. If not from you, then from your widow. That's when I knew. I knew I couldn't protect you and your mother with a bank account. Money could be taken, but the land was different. He explained what he did next. He went to a lawyer in a different county, a man his own father had trusted. He used the last of his emergency cash to set up the trust, putting the deed to the Starlight solely in my name, untouchable until I was an adult. Then he took out a life insurance policy, a big one. He started eating better, taking long walks, trying to get healthy. He was trying to buy time. This is my real legacy to you, Eleanor. Not a failing business, but a choice. When the time comes, and it will, these men will come for this land. They will offer you a fortune, and you can take it. There will be no shame in that. Use it to build a good life, a safe life. Go to college. Travel the world. Do all the things I couldn't give you. But there's another choice. You can keep it. You can fight for it. Because this land is more than just dirt. It's a place where people came to be happy. It's a piece of me. If you choose to fight, it won't be easy. They will try to bully you. They will try to wear you down. But everything you need to win is here. Look in the other envelopes. Look in the walls. Don't trust anyone who comes from the city with a briefcase and a smile. The letter ended with a simple, heartbreaking line. Whatever you choose, know that I loved you more than all the stars in the sky. Be happy, my Ellie. That's all I ever wanted. Love, Dad. I sat there for a long time, the pages resting in my lap. The neat, orderly world I had known for 30 years had been a lie. My father wasn't a failed dreamer. He was a fighter who had seen the enemy coming and had built a fortress for me with the only tools he had: love, foresight, and a few acres of dirt. Richard, had he known? Had he known the property had this kind of potential value? His dismissal of it as a worthless patch of dirt suddenly seemed too vehement, too practiced. And then I remembered a name. Marcus Thorne. Richard had mentioned him. Thorne Development was one of the biggest firms in the state. They were aggressive, powerful, and Richard admired them. He played golf with Marcus's son, Harrison Thorne, a few times. A sick, cold realization washed over me. This wasn't a random inheritance. This was a battlefield, and Richard had just pushed me onto it, unarmed and alone. Or so he thought. The next envelope was thicker, heavier, labeled ammunition. Inside, there were no letters. Instead, there were stacks of documents held together with rusty paper clips. There were geological surveys, water table reports, and environmental impact assessments from the early 1980s. My father had written notes in the margins in his blocky script. Survey from '81 shows a deep, clean aquifer. Best water in the county. County Zoning Board minutes, March '82. Thorne's first attempt to rezone the adjacent parcel for commercial use. Denied. Cites watershed protection. Letter from the state EPA. My complaint about illegal dumping on the north end of the Thorne parcel. They investigated and found industrial solvents. Thorne was fined. My father hadn't just been running a movie theater. He had been gathering intelligence. He had been fighting a quiet, bureaucratic war against Marcus Thorne. He was documenting every shady deal, every environmental shortcut, every bit of pressure Thorne was putting on the local officials. It was a meticulous, damning archive of a rich man's greed. But the most important document was at the bottom. It was a signed, notarized affidavit from a man named Walter Pruitt, dated 1982. In it, Walter, a former employee of Thorn Development, testified that he had personally witnessed Marcus Thorn ordering his crew to bury barrels of industrial waste on the property that bordered the drive-in, and that Thorn had bragged about saving a fortune on proper disposal costs. Thorn was deliberately poisoning the land around my father's property to devalue it, to force a sale. My father had written a note on a sticky tab attached to the affidavit. Walter was scared. He gave me this and left town the next day. He said Thorn would kill him if he found out. This is the ace in the hole, Ellie. Don't play it unless you have to. The final envelope was the thinnest. It was just a single sheet of paper, a ledger from the drive-in's final month of operation. A list of expenses and ticket sales, all written in red ink, showing a staggering loss. But at the very bottom, there was one entry in black ink. It wasn't a number. It was a sentence. The heart of the matter is under the floor of the projection booth, third board from the east wall. For a rainy day, I looked at the clock on the bedside table. It was almost 3 a.m. Sleep was impossible. My mind was a whirlwind of grief, anger, and a strange, fierce new feeling, purpose. For 30 years, I had been an accessory in my own life. A wife, a hostess, a silent partner. My opinions were decorative, my desires secondary. Richard had curated my life until it was as tasteful and as empty as our art-filled house. But the woman who had walked out of that lawyer's office 12 hours ago was gone. In her place was someone else, someone I hadn't met in a very long time. I was my father's daughter, and my father was a fighter. The next morning, I bought a crowbar, a heavy-duty flashlight, and a pair of work gloves at the local hardware store. The man behind the counter, a grizzled old-timer with a friendly face, looked at my pristine city clothes and my clean hands. "Big project?" he asked. "You could say that," I said. "I'm reopening the Starlight." He blinked, then a slow grin spread across his face. "Well, I'll be Frank Gable's girl. I worked for your dad one summer, back in '79. Best job I ever had. He was a good man." "Yes, he was," I said, and for the first time, the words didn't feel like an elegy. They felt like a promise. Back at the drive-in, the daylight was less forgiving. It exposed all the cracks, all the rust, all the decay. The task ahead seemed impossible, a mountain of neglect. But now, I wasn't seeing a ruin. I was seeing a fortress. I was seeing my inheritance. I went straight to the concession stand and into the office. From there, a narrow, steep staircase led up to the projection booth. The room was small and smelled of ozone and dust. 2 massive, hulking projectors stood like sleeping metal beasts in the center of the room. Their lenses, like giant glass eyes, stared out through the thick square of glass toward the screen. I counted the floorboards. 3rd from the east wall. It looked no different from the others. I wedged the tip of the crowbar into the seam and pushed. The old wood groaned, then splintered. I pried it up, revealing a dark, hollow space beneath. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness. And there it was, another metal box, this one smaller and heavier than the one in the office. It was an old military ammunition can. I lifted it out. It was surprisingly heavy. The latches were stiff, but I managed to pry them open. I think I was expecting more documents, more secrets. I was not expecting what I saw. The box was filled with cash. Neat, tight bundles of it, mostly 20s and 50s, wrapped in rubber bands that had gone brittle with age. It wasn't a king's ransom, but it was far from nothing. I sat there on the dusty floor and counted it. It took a long time. When I was done, I counted it again. $37,460. A rainy day fund. My father, the man I'd been told was a terrible businessman, had squirreled this away for me. It was popcorn and ticket money, saved $5 and $10 a time. It was a secret act of love and protection. It was enough. Enough to fix the fence. Enough to get the power turned back on. Enough to buy a new projector bulb. It was enough to start. I sat there for a long time in the quiet, dusty projection booth with my father's secret money in my lap, and I finally understood. He hadn't left me a ruin. He had left me a complete survival kit, a location, a mission, the tools to fight, and the funds to begin. He had given me a choice, and he had given me the means to make it. A week later, the letter I knew was coming finally arrived. It was delivered by courier to my motel room, a crisp, cream-colored envelope from the law firm of Thorne, Miller, and Finch. Inside, on thick, expensive letterhead, was a formal offer from Harrison Thorne, CEO of Thorne Development, to purchase the 15-acre property known as the Starlight Drive-In. The offer was for $300,000. $300,000. To me, a woman whose bank account held less than $2,000, it was a staggering, life-altering sum of money. It was a new start, a small apartment somewhere quiet, a life free from worry and debt. It was the easy, sensible path. It was the path my mother would have told me to take. It was the path Richard was certain I would take. I could almost hear his voice, dripping with condescension. Take the money, Eleanor. Don't be a sentimental fool like your father. The letter stated the offer was final and would expire in 30 days. It was polite, professional, and utterly ruthless. It was a checkbook execution. I called Ms. Davies. I explained everything, the letters, the documents, the money, the offer. She was silent on the other end of the line for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its lawyerly reserve. It was full of awe. My God, Eleanor, your father was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. What do I do? I asked. $300,000 is a lot of money. Yes, it is, she said carefully. And it's a terrible offer. That land isn't just land. With that aquifer, it has water rights. Given the development plans for that whole region, I'd say it's worth at least 4 or 5 times that, probably more if Thorne needs it to secure his larger project. They're lowballing you because they think you're desperate. They think you're a grieving divorcee with no resources. They're expecting you to roll over. So I should fight for more money. You could, she said. We could counter. We could use the leverage your father gave you, the affidavit, the environmental complaints. We could probably get them up to $1 million, maybe more. Or, she paused, you could do what your father hoped you would do. And what's that? Tell them to go to hell, she said, and I heard a smile in her voice. And reopen the drive-in. This is the point in the story where you have to make a choice. We all face these moments. The safe road or the right road. The easy money or the hard-won dream. I think a lot of us are pushed toward the safe road, told that we're being foolish or sentimental for wanting something more, something that has meaning. If you've made it this far into my story, it's probably because you understand that dilemma. You've probably faced a version of it yourself. I'm pausing here to ask you to hit that like button, not for me, but for anyone out there who chose the harder road. Let's show them they're not alone. Now, let's get back to it. I held the phone in my hand, the developer's letter on the cheap motel desk in front of me. $300,000. It was an escape hatch from a life that had just imploded. A quiet, anonymous, safe life. But as I looked at the offer, I didn't see safety. I saw Richard's smug face. I saw Harrison Thorne's terrible smile, the one his father had worn. I saw the end of my father's story, sold off to the very man who had tried to destroy him. And I knew I couldn't do it. For 30 years, I had made the safe choice. I had married the safe man. I had lived the safe life. And it had all been an illusion. The safety was a cage. True safety, I was beginning to realize, wasn't about having money in the bank. It was about knowing who you are. Eleanor, are you still there? Ms. Davies' voice was gentle. I'm here, I said, my own voice clear and steady. Can you do me a favor? Can you draft a response to Mr. Thorne? Of course. What do you want to say? Just 2 words, I said. Let me guess, she replied, a genuine warmth in her tone. No, thank you. Close, I said. Just no. There was a beat of silence, and then she laughed. A real, delighted laugh. I would be honored to send that letter, Eleanor. Consider it done. Pro bono. After I hung up, a feeling of pure, unadulterated terror washed over me, followed immediately by a wave of exhilarating freedom. I had just turned down a fortune. I had declared war on a powerful man. I had chosen a pile of rubble over a comfortable life. I was terrified, and I had never felt more alive. The next day, I moved out of the motel. I couldn't afford to keep paying for the room, And besides, my place was at the Starlight. I bought a used pop-up camper for a few $100s and parked it behind the concession stand, nestled in a grove of pine trees. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The work began. The first order of business was clearing the land. Decades of weeds, brush, and small trees had turned the parking area into a jungle. I bought a heavy-duty brush cutter and spent 10 hours a day, day after day, under the hot August sun, wrestling with nature. My muscles screamed. My hands were covered in blisters and scratches. I was exhausted and filthy by the end of each day. It was the most satisfying work I had ever done. Slowly, painstakingly, the field began to re-emerge. The neat rows of speaker poles became visible again. The gentle, sloping curve of the lot, designed for perfect sight lines, revealed itself. As I worked, people started to notice. Cars would slow down on the county road. Sometimes they'd pull in. An elderly man in a pickup truck stopped one afternoon. "You're Frank's girl, aren't you?" he asked, his eyes twinkling. "I saw you clearing this out. Thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. My wife and I had our first date right there," he said, pointing to a spot in the third row. Saw the sting. 1973-inch. A woman my age pulled in a few days later. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice full of hope. "Are you really opening this place back up? We used to pile all the neighborhood kids into the back of my dad's station wagon and come here every Friday night." The stories kept coming. It turned out the Starlight wasn't just a forgotten piece of property. It was a landmark in the town's collective memory. It was a place of first dates, family outings, and teenage rites of passage. I wasn't just restoring a piece of land. I was excavating a piece of the town's heart. The man from the hardware store, whose name was Tom, started stopping by after his shift. He'd bring me a cold drink and inspect my progress. "You're going to need a new fence," he said one day, kicking at the rusted, collapsed chain link. "And the wiring to those poles is probably all chewed to hell by squirrels." "I know," I said, wiping sweat from my forehead. "One thing at a time." The next Saturday, Tom showed up with 3 other men and a truck full of tools and fence posts. "The boys and I had a slow morning," he said, avoiding my eyes. "Figured we'd give you a hand." They worked all day. They didn't ask for a dime. When I tried to thank them, Tom just shrugged. Frank gave my older brother a job when no one else would. He was a good man. This town owes him 1 inch. That was just the beginning. A retired electrician named Sal heard what was happening and offered to inspect the wiring for free. He spent a week patiently tracing lines, replacing brittle wires, and getting the main panel up to code. A young woman named Maya, a tech whiz who worked remotely from her family's farm, heard about the project and came to look at the projectors. "Wow," she breathed, running a reverent hand over the metal housing. "These are Century Model CS. They're tanks. They don't make them like this anymore." She spent the next 2 weeks taking them apart, cleaning every lens, oiling every gear, and figuring out how to interface them with a modern digital sound system. The concession stand was the biggest challenge. It was a grimy, derelict mess. But a crew of women from the local church, armed with buckets, mops, and decades of potluck organizing experience, descended one weekend and scoured the place from top to bottom. They scrubbed the floors, washed the walls, and polished the chrome on the old popcorn machine until it gleamed. I used my father's money carefully, buying only what was essential: lumber, wire, paint, a new digital projector for backup, and the licensing fees for the first month's movies. Every dollar was accounted for in a new ledger I kept on the old desk in the office. There was a response from Harrison Thorne. Not a letter this time, but a visit. A black luxury sedan, looking completely out of place, crunched down the gravel road one afternoon. A man in a tailored suit got out. He was handsome, slick, and had the same predatory smile I'd read about in my father's letter. "Eleanor Gable?" he asked, not offering a hand. He looked around at the flurry of activity. Sal on a ladder, Tom mending the fence, me covered in paint, with an expression of amused contempt. "Harrison Thorne, I believe you received my offer." "I did," I said, my heart pounding. I refused to let him see my fear. I stood my ground. "My offer was more than generous," he said, his voice smooth and cold. "It was a kindness. This place is a relic. You're pouring money into a grave." "I disagree," I said simply. He took a step closer. Let me be clear. My father wanted this land. I want this land. We are building a luxury golf resort and residential community. Your little nostalgia project is in the way. I will not be stopped by a sentimental old woman playing in the dirt. The insult was meant to sting, to diminish me. But it didn't, because I wasn't that woman anymore. Then I guess you have a problem, Mr. Thorne, I said, my voice steady. Because this sentimental old woman isn't selling. This is my property. Now I'd like you to get off it. His eyes narrowed. For a second, I saw the raw, ugly anger beneath the polished veneer. He looked like he was about to say something else, something worse. But then he seemed to think better of it. He gave a short, humorless laugh. Have it your way. But when this little fantasy of yours comes crashing down, my offer will be off the table. I'll just wait and buy it from the bank at auction for pennies on the dollar. He got back in his car and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust behind him. I stood there, my hands clenched into fists, my whole body trembling with adrenaline. The confrontation was terrifying, but I had faced him and I hadn't backed down. The threat of the auction hung in the air. I knew he was right. If I couldn't make the drive-in profitable, I would lose it. The fight wasn't over. It had just entered a new phase. Failure was not an option. We set an opening night, the first Friday in October. We'd show a double feature, a classic family movie and a beloved 80s blockbuster. Tom helped me repaint the giant sign at the entrance. We couldn't afford new neon, so we painted it by hand in bright, cheerful colors, the Starlight Drive-In. Reopening soon. The town was buzzing. The local paper ran a story about us on the front page. People were excited, but I was terrified. What if no one came? What if the whole thing was a colossal, humiliating failure? The day of the opening, I was a wreck. I paced the length of the property, checking and rechecking everything. The popcorn machine was full. The hot dogs were ready. Maya had tested the projector a dozen times. The sound was broadcasting perfectly on the FM frequency she had set up. Everything was ready. All we needed were people. As the sun began to set, I stood by the newly rebuilt ticket booth, my hands clammy. The sky was clear and cold. A perfect night for a movie under the stars. And then I saw it. A single pair of headlights turned off the county road and came down the gravel path. It was the old man who'd had his first aid here, his wife beside him in their old pickup truck. He handed me a $10 bill. "One ticket for two?" "Please," he said with a huge grin. I almost burst into tears. I took his money and handed him a ticket. "Welcome back to the Starlight," I managed to say. And then another car came, and another, and another. A steady stream of headlights poured in, filling the field. Families in minivans, teenagers in their parents' cars, older couples who remembered the place from its first life. They kept coming until the entire lot was full. We were sold out. I walked back to the projection booth just as the first movie was about to start. Maya gave me a thumbs up. I stood at the window, looking out at the scene below. The field was filled with cars, their interiors softly lit by dashboard lights. The low, happy murmur of hundreds of people settling in for the show drifted up to me. The giant screen, once a broken skeleton, flickered to life, bright and whole. I thought of my father. I thought of his letters, of his fierce, quiet love. He had worried that he had left me nothing but a failing business. He was so wrong. He had left me a community. He had left me a purpose. He had left me a home. He had left me a sky full of stars. I didn't fight Richard. I didn't sue him for more money. I didn't need to. My victory wasn't about taking back what he had stolen from me. It was about building something he could never touch. He had taken a house, but I had a home. He had taken the money, but I had a legacy. He thought he had left me with nothing, but he had inadvertently given me everything. This story, my story, isn't really about a divorce or a drive-in. It's about the fact that it's never too late to become the person you were supposed to be. It's about the things we inherit, not the money or the property, but the courage, the resilience, and the love that gets passed down in the stories we tell and the choices we make. It's about realizing that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find yourself. The Starlight is doing well. We show movies every weekend from April to October. We have classic car nights and local music before the shows. It's not a gold mine, but it pays its bills. It's a place where people come to be happy, just like my father wanted. Harrison Thorne is still out there, his development stalled by a series of environmental challenges and zoning disputes, many of them based on the meticulous records my father kept. The fight isn't over, but now, I'm not fighting alone. I have a whole town on my back. If my story has meant something to you, if it has given you a little bit of hope on a hard day, then do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel and share your own story in the comments. Tell me about a time you chose the harder road. Tell me about a legacy someone left for you that had nothing to do with money. This space isn't just for my story, it's for ours. Because we are all fighting for our own little patch of dirt, for our own place to see the stars. Thank you for listening.